The wind cut through the narrow mountain pass like a blade, carrying dust, whispers, and the smell of burned wood from distant camps. At the edge of the settlement, where stone paths turned to rough earth, a strange gathering had formed, quiet, tense, and unspoken. This was not a market in the usual sense. There were no colorful stalls, no laughter of traders, no children running between cloth tents. Instead, there were circles of men standing too still, women watching from behind veils, and a heavy silence that made every small sound feel dangerous. They called it, in hushed voices, the place where unwanted futures are decided. And at the center of it all stood her, a young woman barely more than a girl, with her head covered completely in a coarse sack tied loosely around her neck. It hid her face, her expression, her identity, reducing her to something unnamed. She stood very still, as if movement itself might draw punishment. No one spoke to her directly, not because she could not hear, but because she was not meant to be acknowledged. Behind her, 2 guards kept watch, though their weapons were not raised. They didn't need to be. In this place, obedience was older than force. She remembered very little about how she got here. Only fragments, voices arguing, a long journey in the back of a cart, and the final moment when someone said, "She has no place left." That sentence had followed her ever since. Now she was simply left. Around her, deals were being made in low tones, not for goods, not for livestock, but for survival arrangements disguised as tradition. Some called it protection, others called it burden sharing, but everyone here understood the truth. This was where people came when they had nowhere else to go. Rejection did not always mean hatred. Sometimes it meant abandonment. A few steps away, men examined lists, nodded at names, and occasionally glanced toward the silent figure in the sack. Some shook their heads and walked away. Others laughed under their breath, as if even considering her presence was a mistake. "She won't last in the mountains," one man muttered. "Too quiet," said another. "Quiet ones break first." No one asked her anything, not her name, not her past, not even if she agreed, because agreement was not part of the process. The sun shifted slowly above them, casting long shadows across the ground. Dust drifted through the air like fading memories. Time here did not feel like time. It felt like waiting for something inevitable. Then, the mood changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture, a tightening of attention, the way conversations slowly faded into silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. From the far edge of the settlement, a figure approached. He walked alone, no escort, no greeting, no hesitation. He wore dark, weather-worn clothing suited for harsh terrain. His presence did not demand attention, it absorbed it. People noticed him not because he tried to be seen, but because ignoring him felt like a mistake. He was known in whispers across the mountain routes, a man who lived outside normal settlements, a man who did not stay where he was not wanted. Some said he had once belonged to a group of warriors, others said he had cut ties with everyone, including his own past. No one was certain which version was true, but everyone agreed on one thing: he did not come looking for comfort. The crowd subtly shifted as he entered the circle of watchers. Conversations stopped completely now. Even those who had been laughing moments earlier went quiet. He didn't look at them for long. His eyes moved across the space like someone assessing weather, terrain, survival, not people. Then he stopped, right in front of her. She could feel his presence, like a change in pressure, like standing too close to a storm that had not yet decided whether to break. For a long moment, nothing happened. No words were exchanged. No introduction was made. The silence stretched until it became unbearable for those watching. Then, in a voice calm and firm, he spoke just one sentence. "I'll take her." It was not loud. It was not emotional. It was not explained. But it changed everything. A ripple went through the crowd. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Some looked at each other as if they had misunderstood. Others stared at him as if he had made a mistake he would regret. "She," someone whispered. "Her," another repeated, almost laughing. But the man did not repeat himself. He did not justify his choice. He simply remained there waiting as if the decision had already been made, long before he arrived. The girl beneath the sack did not react outwardly, but inside something tightened. Not hope, not fear, but uncertainty deeper than both. because in this place being chosen did not always mean being saved. Sometimes it only meant being taken. And as the wind returned, swirling dust between them, the silence of the settlement broke into something far more dangerous than noise.
The moment the words, "I'll take her," settled into the air, the settlement did not return to normal. It changed shape. People stopped pretending to be busy. Conversations that had been half alive earlier now died completely. Even the guards shifted their stance, not because they planned to interfere, but because something about the decision felt heavier than usual transactions. It was not uncommon for someone to take a rejected bride, but it was uncommon for him to choose one. The man still stood in front of her, unmoving, as if the world around him had already stopped mattering. The wind brushed against his coat, lifting dust at his boots, but he didn't react. His attention remained fixed on the silent figure with the sack over her head. No one dared step closer, not even the traders who usually pushed deals forward with greed or urgency, because this man did not belong to their system in a way they could understand. They knew him only as the Mountain Man, though even that name felt too simple for what he represented. He was not a leader, not a merchant, not a soldier under command. He existed on the edges of territories, moving between isolated routes where law was less important than survival. People said he once had a place in a warrior clan, one that valued discipline, loyalty, and silence. But something had broken that connection. Some said betrayal, others said loss. No one agreed on the truth, but everyone agreed on the outcome. He no longer belonged anywhere. And men who do not belong anywhere often become unpredictable. A trader nearby cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "She is not worth much," he said carefully, trying to sound respectful while also warning him. "No skills, no known family ties, no standing." The words were meant to discourage him, to redirect his attention toward better options, brighter choices, safer choices, profitable ones. But the man did not respond immediately. Instead, he finally looked away from the girl for the first time and glanced at the trader. It was a brief glance, but it carried something that made the trader instinctively step back half a pace. Not anger, not threat, just certainty. "I didn't ask for her value," the man said quietly. The trader swallowed. That was the end of negotiation. Around them, murmurs began again, low and uneasy. People tried to understand the decision, but nothing about it fit their expectations. The rejected bride was usually taken by those desperate for labor, companionship, or control. But this man showed none of those motivations openly. He did not inspect her like property. He did not bargain. He did not hesitate. He simply chose. The girl, still standing under the sack, could feel the attention shifting toward her like pressure on the skin. Even without seeing faces, she could sense the judgment of the crowd. It was familiar. Judgment was something she had lived under long before this moment. But this was different, because now she was being chosen by someone who frightened the rest of them. The trader finally stepped forward with a scroll and muttered the formal words of transfer. Ink was pressed, marks were made, and the transaction, if it could even be called that, was completed. No celebration followed, only silence. When it was done, the man turned slightly toward her. For the first time, he spoke directly to her. "You will come with me," he said. Not a question, not a request, a statement. The girl did not answer. She couldn't. Her silence was not defiance. In places like this, silence often meant safety. But something in his voice made her pause internally. It was not harsh, not mocking, not dismissive. It was controlled, measured, like someone who was used to giving orders that must be followed in dangerous places. One of the older men nearby laughed under his breath. "She won't speak," he said. "Don't expect anything from her." The mountain man did not react to the comment. Instead, he reached into his belt and produced a small cloth wrap. tossing it toward the trader as payment. No argument followed, no counting, no verification. He had already decided the value long before arriving. Then, finally, he turned fully toward her. And that was when the second rule was spoken. "You will keep the sack on," he said. A pause. "No talking unless I allow it. No questions unless necessary, and no revealing your face." The words landed heavily. The crowd shifted again, this time with confusion mixed with curiosity. A bride taken without seeing her face was unusual. A bride restricted from speaking was stricter still. It was not affection. It was control, but not the reckless kind. It was structured, intentional, almost military in its precision. The girl's hands tightened slightly at her sides, though no one saw it. Under the sack, her breathing remained steady, but something inside her had begun to change. Not fear exactly, not relief, something closer to alertness. Because rules meant structure, and structure meant purpose. The man turned away from the crowd and stepped forward, expecting her to follow. For a moment, she did not move. Then slowly, hesitantly, she followed him. As they left the center of the settlement, the silence behind them grew louder than any sound. And no one, not the traders, not the guards, not the watchers, could explain why the man who lived beyond belonging had just chosen the one person no one else wanted. As if he already knew something they did not. The settlement faded behind them, like a bad memory that refused to disappear completely. Dust rose with every step, carried by the wind into thin spirals that clung briefly to their path before dissolving again. The girl followed silently, the sack still tightly tied over her head, cutting off the world, but not sound. She could hear everything: his footsteps, distant animal calls, the faint creak of leather straps as he adjusted his gear. He did not look back to check if she was following. That alone felt unusual. Most people who took others from the settlement behaved differently. They watched constantly, as if expecting escape or resistance. But this man moved as if her presence behind him was already guaranteed, as if the decision had sealed itself permanently. The mountain trail ahead was narrow, carved between jagged rock and scattered pine. The air grew colder with every step upward. The settlement below had been dry, suffocating, loud in its own quiet way. Up here, everything felt open, but also distant, as if the world itself was retreating. Hours passed without conversation. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was structured, not chaotic like before, controlled. Even the wind seemed less aggressive here, slipping through the trees instead of striking them. At one point, the man stopped near a flat stone ledge overlooking a deep valley. He raised his hand slightly. She stopped immediately. It was not spoken instruction, but she understood it instinctively. He looked down the valley for a moment, scanning the terrain below. Then he dropped his pack and began adjusting straps, tightening what needed tightening, loosening what needed loosening. Everything he did was precise, practiced, like someone who had done this journey countless times alone. Still, he never acknowledged her directly. Not once. That absence of attention should have made her feel invisible, but instead, it made her feel observed in a different way, like she was part of his environment rather than an object of curiosity. After a while, he spoke without turning around. "You're quiet." It was not a compliment, not an insult either, just a fact stated plainly. She did not respond. He waited a moment, then added, "That's fine." And that was it. No pressure, no demand. For reasons she could not explain, that lack of insistence felt heavier than interrogation ever had. They continued. As the sun shifted toward late afternoon, the trail became more difficult. Loose stones rolled underfoot. The wind picked up again, cutting through the narrow passages between cliffs. Still, he did not slow down. But something subtle began to change. The girl started noticing details she had not paid attention to before. He never stumbled, not once. Even on unstable ground, his steps adjusted instantly, like someone who could read the terrain before it revealed itself. His awareness extended beyond the obvious path. He reacted to distant sounds, shifted direction slightly when birds suddenly flew from trees, and paused only when the air itself changed. It was not random movement. It was survival instinct refined into discipline. At one point, a distant echo of rock falling somewhere ahead made him stop completely. He raised a hand again, this time more firm. They stood still for nearly a minute. Then he changed direction without explanation, guiding her off the main trail into a narrower side path that climbed through denser trees. She followed without question. Something about him made questioning feel unnecessary, not because she trusted him, but because it seemed like he already had answers she didn't know how to ask. As they walked, she began to sense something else beneath the silence. Observation. Not of her face, he had not seen it yet, but of her behavior. It was subtle. He did not turn often. He did not ask direct questions. But every so often, he would slow slightly when she stepped over uneven ground, or pause when she hesitated near a drop. Almost like he was measuring her reactions, testing without words. Hours later, they reached a temporary shelter point, an old stone overhang partially protected from wind. He stopped there and finally set his pack down fully. The girl remained standing. For the first time since the settlement, he spoke a longer sentence. "We rest here until morning." She nodded slightly, though he could not see it clearly under the sack. Then he added something that made the air feel heavier. "After that, we continue to my place." A simple statement, but it carried weight. Not threat, not promise, destination. The girl sat slowly against the stone wall, careful, controlled. The sack still covered her face, restricting everything except breath and sound. The man lit a small fire nearby, using dry wood he had gathered without effort. The flame caught quickly, as if even fire obeyed him in this environment. The orange glow lit the edges of the stone shelter, casting moving shadows. For a long time, neither of them spoke. But something had already shifted. The journey was no longer about escape or survival from the settlement. It was about what came next. And neither of them, not the silent girl with the hidden face, nor the man who chose her without hesitation, fully understood what this deal would become once the truth beneath it began to surface. Night settled over the mountains like a heavy curtain that swallowed distance and softened sound. The fire crackled inside the stone overhang, sending warm light flickering across the uneven walls. Outside, the wind moved steadily through the trees, but it felt far away, like another world trying and failing to reach them. Inside, there was only silence and firelight. The girl sat close to the stone wall, knees slightly drawn in, hands folded carefully in her lap. The sack still covered her head completely, its rough fabric pressing lightly against her skin. It dulled her vision of everything, light, movement, danger. But it also created something else, a barrier between her and the world, and perhaps between her and fear. Across from her, the man sat with his back partially turned, sharpening a small blade with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of metal against stone was soft, but steady, like a rhythm he had done 1,000 times without thinking. He did not rush. He did not fidget. Everything about him suggested control. Not emotional control, but practiced survival discipline. Minutes passed, then hours. The silence between them was no longer the tense silence of the settlement. It was different now, structured, almost ritualistic. It did not demand anything. It simply existed. At one point, the girl shifted slightly, adjusting her position against the stone wall. Immediately, the man paused, his blade sharpening, not fully turning, just pausing. Then he resumed after a moment, as if confirming nothing was wrong. She noticed it. It was small, but it mattered. He was aware of everything. Eventually, he spoke without looking at her. "You're not injured?" The question was direct, but not intrusive. She hesitated for a moment, then gave a small shake of her head beneath the sack. He nodded once. That was all. No follow-up. No expectation of explanation. The fire crackled again, sending a small burst of sparks upward before fading into the dark ceiling of the overhang. A few minutes later, he reached into his pack and threw something lightly toward her. She caught it instinctively. Bread. Hard, dry travel bread wrapped in cloth. "Eat," he said simply. She did not immediately move. In places like the settlement, food given freely often came with cost, intention, or hidden meaning. Nothing was ever just food. But here, there was no demand attached to it. After a pause, she slowly unwrapped it and began to eat quietly. He did not watch her, at least not directly. But she could feel that he noticed when she started eating and when she paused. It was the same kind of awareness he had shown on the trail, not intrusive, but constant. After some time, he finally spoke again. "You will follow 3 rules while you are with me." His voice was calm, not louder than before, but more structured, like something rehearsed long before this moment. The girl stopped eating. She waited. He continued. "First, you keep the sack on." The fire flickered. "Second, you speak only when I ask you to." A pause. "Third, you do not move without telling me first when we are in unfamiliar ground." Silence followed his words. Not because the rules were shocking, but because of how precise they were. They were not emotional rules. They were survival rules. Structured, practical, almost like guidelines for moving through dangerous terrain. She slowly lowered her hands. Then, almost cautiously, she nodded. He acknowledged it with a brief tilt of his head. No approval. Just confirmation. Outside, the wind grew stronger for a moment, pushing against the stone overhang like it was testing its strength. Dust and leaves swirled briefly at the entrance before settling again. The girl adjusted slightly where she sat. The sack still covered her face. But now, it felt different. Not like punishment, not like humiliation. Something closer to protection. But protection with boundaries she did not yet understand. After a long pause, she finally spoke, barely above a whisper, as if testing whether the rule would break immediately. "Why the sack?" The question entered the space carefully, like something fragile. The man did not answer right away. For the first time since the journey began, he stopped what he was doing completely. The blade in his hand lowered. The firelight reflected faintly off its edge. He looked toward her, not at her face, but at where her head was covered. A long silence followed. Then he spoke, slower than before. "Because if people see your face—" He stopped, not finishing the sentence immediately. That pause alone made the air feel tighter. Then he added, "They will stop asking who you are, and start remembering who you were supposed to be." The words landed heavily in the firelit space. The girl froze, not because she understood everything, but because something in his tone suggested that the truth was not about her present. It was about a past that had not been erased, only hidden. And for the first time since she was brought to that settlement, she felt something shift beneath her silence. Not fear, not safety, recognition without memory. Across the fire, the man returned to sharpening his blade, but his movements were slower now, like someone who had just stepped closer to a truth he had been avoiding for a very long time. Morning arrived in the mountains without announcement. There was no gentle transition, no soft sunrise in the sky, only a gradual lifting of darkness, as if night had simply grown tired and stepped away. The fire had burned down to pale ash, still warm at the center. The stone overhang remained cold at its edges, holding on to the memory of wind and silence. The girl had barely slept. not because she was afraid of the place itself, but because her mind refused to settle. The sack still covered her face, but it no longer felt like the same kind of barrier it had been before. Now it felt like a question she could not see. Across from her, the man was already awake. He did not stretch. He did not yawn. He simply moved from stillness to action, as if sleep were a short pause rather than a necessity. He checked his pack, adjusted straps, and extinguished the last traces of ash with precise motions. No wasted movement, no hesitation. When he finally spoke, it was brief. "We move." That was all. The girl stood carefully, adjusting her balance. Her legs were slightly stiff, but she did not show discomfort. She had learned quickly that this man did not respond to weakness or complaint, only to function. They left the shelter and returned to the trail. The air was colder than the previous day. A thin mist lingered between the trees, softening the edges of the world. Rocks were damp. Leaves clung to each other as if reluctant to separate. The journey resumed in silence. But something began to change. At first, it was subtle. The man slowed slightly, not enough to be noticeable as hesitation, but enough for someone paying attention to recognize adjustment. He began choosing paths with more care, avoiding certain slopes, redirecting their route to safer ground. The girl noticed this pattern. He was not simply walking forward. He was reading the mountain. Every few minutes, he would stop briefly, tilt his head, or shift direction based on something she could not perceive. A distant sound, a change in wind, the movement of birds suddenly taking flight from a specific direction. He never explained it, but he reacted every time. At one point, she heard nothing unusual, no sound, no warning, but he suddenly grabbed her arm gently and guided her behind a cluster of rocks. He held up a hand. Silence. They waited. Moments passed. Then a group of distant travelers appeared on the higher ridge path above them, barely visible through the mist. Armed silhouettes moving slowly, scanning the terrain. The girl held her breath instinctively, but the man remained calm. He did not move until they passed completely. Only then did he release his grip and step forward again. No explanation followed, but something inside her shifted. He was not just cautious, he was avoiding something, or someone. As they continued, she began to notice more inconsistencies in how he behaved around her. Sometimes he walked slightly ahead, but never too far. Sometimes he paused when she struggled on uneven ground, but never turned to watch directly. Once, when she stumbled on loose stone, she expected him to react sharply, but instead he adjusted his pace slightly and said nothing. It was as if he was tracking her ability without interfering, measuring her survival instinct, testing without confrontation. Hours later, they stopped near a narrow stream cutting through the rocks. The water was fast but shallow, clear enough to reflect broken pieces of sky. The man knelt and drank first. Only then did he speak. "You notice things quickly," he said. It was not praise, not accusation, observation. The girl hesitated, then gave a small nod under the sack. He accepted that and stood again. "That helps," he added simply. A pause. Then, almost as if continuing a thought he had not planned to share, he said, "This path is not empty." She did not respond, but she understood enough to feel tension rise again beneath the quiet. They were not alone in these mountains. They had never been alone. As they moved again, the terrain began to change. Trees grew denser, paths narrowed, the air felt heavier, as if the mountain itself was compressing around them. And yet, the man's awareness did not weaken. It sharpened. Every sound mattered. Every shift in wind mattered. Even her footsteps mattered. At one point, he spoke again, without turning. "Do not remove the sack, not even for comfort." There was something in his tone that made the instruction feel heavier than before. Not rule, warning. The girl did not ask why. She had already learned that questions were answered only when necessary. As afternoon approached, they reached a higher ridge overlooking a deep valley filled with drifting fog. From there, The world looked endless, layers of mountains fading into white silence. They stopped briefly. The man stood at the edge, scanning the distance for a long time. The girl waited behind him. For a brief moment, the wind shifted, pulling the edge of her sack slightly. She instinctively raised her hand to adjust it. But before she could fully move, he spoke without looking back. "Leave it." She froze. A pause. Then slowly lowered her hand. The wind settled again. And in that small moment, something unspoken passed between them. Control was not random. It was deliberate. And whatever lay ahead on this path was not just about survival anymore. It was about identity, something neither of them had fully revealed, or fully remembered yet. By late afternoon, the sky had begun to change. The mist that had followed them through the lower trails thickened into heavier clouds, pressing down on the mountains like a warning. The wind no longer felt like a passing force. It felt persistent, circling them, testing every exposed edge of the terrain. The path narrowed sharply. Rock walls rose on both sides, forming a natural corridor that swallowed sound. Even their footsteps seemed muted here, as if the mountains refused to echo anything that entered. The man stopped. This time, it was not gradual, it was immediate. His entire posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The relaxed precision he had carried all day tightened into alert stillness. His hand moved slightly toward the strap of his weapon, without drawing it. The girl felt it instantly. Something had changed. He raised his hand once again, firm, controlled. "Stop." She obeyed immediately. No hesitation. They stood in silence inside the stone corridor. For a long moment, nothing happened. Only wind. Faintly, something echoed ahead. Not footsteps, not voices, something heavier. A low, uneven sound, like movement through rock and gravel. Multiple sources, not random windfall, but coordinated motion. The man tilted his head slightly, listening deeper than normal hearing allowed. The girl did not move. She could feel it now too. Not sound exactly, but tension in the air, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. He shifted slightly closer to the rock wall, pulling her back with a subtle motion of his hand. "Just guidance." Then he whispered for the first time in a while, "Stay behind me." It was not dramatic, but it carried weight. A moment later, shadows began to appear at the far end of the corridor. Slow at first, then more defined. Figures emerged from the misted rock path ahead. 3, then 5, then more. Their movements were careful, controlled, and intentionally spaced. They were not travelers. They were watchers. The man did not retreat. He stepped forward instead. One pace, then stopped. The figures halted as well. A silent standoff formed in the middle of the mountain passage. The girl remained behind him, unseen except for the faint outline of her form beneath the sack. One of the figures spoke. "You travel with something that was not meant to leave the settlement." The voice was calm, but not neutral. It carried recognition. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at them carefully, counting, assessing, measuring distance and terrain in a single sweep. Then he spoke. "She is not yours." A pause. The figures shifted slightly. "That is not your decision," another replied. The air tightened. The girl felt her heartbeat increase, though she remained still. She did not understand the full meaning of what was happening, but she understood enough. They were not here by accident. They were here for her, or what she represented. The man exhaled slowly, not in fear, but in calculation. Then he said something unexpected. "She is not what you think she is." The words caused a brief hesitation among the figures. That pause was small, but important. It suggested uncertainty, and uncertainty was weakness in places like this. One of them stepped forward slightly. "Remove the sack," he ordered. The girl stiffened. The command was not directed at her alone. it was directed at him. A demand for revelation, for confirmation. The man did not move. Instead, his voice lowered slightly. "If I do that," he said, "you will all stop thinking." Silence followed. The tension in the corridor became almost physical. The wind outside pressed harder against the rock opening, but even it seemed reluctant to enter. The figures slowly began to spread, positioning themselves in a loose arc. They were preparing, not negotiating, preparing. The man shifted his stance slightly, just enough for the girl to notice. This was no longer avoidance. This was containment. Then, in a sudden controlled motion, he spoke one final instruction without turning back. "When I move, do not hesitate." The girl did not respond, but she understood. This was no longer a journey, it was a breaking point. The first movement came not from him, but from one of the figures stepping forward too quickly, breaking the silent agreement. That was enough. The man moved, not wildly, not chaotically, but with precise violence of motion. Fast, direct, controlled, like someone who had fought in places where hesitation meant death. The corridor erupted into motion. Dust, sound, shifting shadows. And through it all, the girl remained still for a split second longer than she should have, her hand instinctively tightening under the sack, not because she was waiting, but because for the first time she understood. Whatever truth was coming next was already buried inside her. The mountain corridor became chaos in seconds. Dust lifted from the ground in thick waves, scraping against stone walls as bodies moved through narrow space. Every sound collided: footsteps, harsh breaths, the sharp scrape of metal against rock. The mist that had once softened the valley was now torn apart by motion. But within that chaos, the man moved with unnatural control. Not faster than everyone, more precise than everyone. Each step placed where resistance was weakest. Each motion calculated not for attack alone, but for position, distance, and survival. The narrow corridor that should have trapped him became something else entirely. A controlled field where every angle mattered. The figures who had arrived in formation now struggled to maintain it. Too many were reacting at once. Too little coordination under pressure. And the man used that. A sharp movement to the side, one step into blind space, caused two of them to hesitate. That hesitation created space. Space created control. Control created advantage. The girl stayed behind the rock wall as instructed, still, but not detached. She could feel everything, not visually, but through sound, vibration, tension in air. The world had become incomplete, and yet somehow more intense. At one point, a heavy impact echoed close enough that she instinctively flinched. Stone cracked somewhere nearby. A body hit the ground, though she did not know whose. The man's voice cut through briefly, "Don't move." Not shouted, just delivered. And that was enough to anchor her. Then, suddenly, the pattern shifted. The attackers began to retreat slightly, repositioning instead of advancing directly. Not because they were defeated, but because they were regrouping. This was not a fight meant to end quickly. It was meant to capture, or force exposure. The girl realized this in fragments, not fully, but enough to understand she was the center of it. Then came the moment everything changed. A sharp command from one of the figures, "Take the sack off her." That sentence hit the air like a trigger. The man turned instantly. For the first time, his composure cracked, not into panic, but into something colder: decision. He moved toward her position faster than before, cutting across the corridor, intercepting the line of sight between her and the advancing figures. But he was not fast enough to prevent what came next. A sudden rush from the side, one of the attackers breaking formation, reached toward her. Not directly attacking her, reaching for the sack. The girl instinctively stepped back, but the corridor was too narrow. Her shoulder hit stone. She had no space to retreat further. The hand grabbed the edge of the sack. For a split second, everything slowed. The man saw it. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. Not hesitation, but recognition of consequence. "Don't," one voice began. Too late. The sack was pulled. The fabric loosened. Light, filtered, broken, uncertain, hit her face for the first time in what felt like an entire lifetime. The world did not explode. It stopped. The attacker who had pulled the sack froze instantly. Not fear, not shock alone. Recognition. The girl's face was visible now, uncovered, unhidden, and something about it broke the logic of the situation. The corridor fell into a strange silence that lasted only a heartbeat, but felt much longer. The man turned fully toward her, and for the first time since the journey began, he stopped moving completely. Not because he was trapped, not because he was overwhelmed, but because he had seen her, really seen her. His expression changed in a way no one else noticed immediately. The cold precision of his face did not disappear, but something beneath it fractured into memory. A memory that should not have been present. His breath slowed. The attackers around him did not advance. Even they felt the shift. Then he whispered, not to them, not to the world, but to himself. "No." The girl looked at him, now exposed, now visible. And something in her own expression changed too. Not recognition of him as he is now, but of something buried in the past she had not been able to name. The man took one slow step forward, then another, not toward the attackers, toward her. The chaos around them seemed distant now, as if the corridor had widened into emptiness. He stopped directly in front of her. His voice, when it came, was barely audible. "I was told you were gone." The words did not fit the situation. They did not belong to this moment of conflict. But they belonged to something deeper. The girl's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Because in that instant, the truth was no longer outside her. It was inside her. The attackers hesitated again, unsure whether to continue. But none of that mattered anymore. Because the man who had bought a rejected bride was not looking at a stranger anymore. He was looking at someone he was never supposed to see again. And everything that came before this moment was about to collapse into truth. The mountain corridor no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a suspended moment in time, where even sound had lost confidence in moving forward. The attackers, still present, no longer advanced. Their formation had broken into uncertainty. Some stepped back instinctively, sensing that whatever had just unfolded was no longer something they controlled. Because control had shifted, not through strength, but through recognition. The man stood in front of the girl, unmoving, as if the world behind him had been sealed off. The chaos, the dust, the distant tension, all of it blurred into background noise. His focus did not waver from her face. Now uncovered. Now real. Her expression was not fear, not relief. Something far more complicated. Confusion layered over memory she could not fully access. The sack lay loose around her shoulders, forgotten. Neither of them moved to fix it. The man's voice came again, lower this time. "Look at me." It was not a command. It was a request that carried weight. Slowly the girl raised her eyes. And in that moment, something invisible snapped into place. Not a physical reaction, but a recognition buried beneath years of distance, silence, and erased identity. The man's face tightened slightly, not in anger, in disbelief, because what he was seeing did not belong to the version of the past he had survived. It belonged to the version he had failed to save. Behind them, one of the attackers muttered uncertain, "You know her." But no one answered. The man stepped closer, not threatening, not cautious anymore, just certain. "I searched for you," he said quietly. A pause, then another truth heavier than the first. "They told me you didn't survive." The girl's breathing changed slightly. Not fast, not panicked, but unsteady in a way that suggested something inside her was trying to surface through layers of forgotten time. Her voice finally broke through the silence, soft, uncertain, as if unused for a long time. I don't remember everything. That sentence changed the air again, because it confirmed what he already feared and hoped. Memory had been damaged, hidden, or forced away. The man's hand lowered slightly. Ah. His posture shifted. Not relaxed, but redirected. The fight was no longer the priority. The past was. The attackers behind them began to slowly withdraw further, realizing they were no longer part of the moment. Whatever they had come for, control, exposure, leverage, had dissolved into something far more dangerous. Truth between two people who had history no one else understood. One of them finally spoke. This is not over. But even that sounded uncertain now. And then they left. Not defeated, but unwilling to remain in something they no longer controlled. Silence returned to the corridor. The wind outside continued, indifferent to everything that had just changed. Only the two of them remained at the center of what felt like a broken timeline. The girl looked down at the sack still hanging loosely around her shoulders, then back at him. "What was I to you?" she asked quietly. The question did not come from confusion alone. It came from absence, from missing time. The man hesitated. For the first time since the beginning of the story, he did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Not controlled like before, not distant, just honest. "You were not meant to be taken from me." A pause, then the truth fully revealed. "You were my past, before I became what I am now." The words settled between them. Heavy, final, but not ending, because endings require closure, and neither of them had that yet. The girl slowly reached up and touched the edge of the sack again, not to remove it, but to feel its weight differently now. Not as concealment, but as something that had been hiding a life she had lost. The man stepped slightly closer, carefully, as if approaching something fragile that could disappear if handled incorrectly. "I didn't recognize you at first," he admitted, a faint pause, "because I never thought I would see you again." Behind them, the mountains remained silent witnesses. No celebration, no resolution, only the slow realization that everything that had happened, the purchase, the journey, the rules, the silence, had been shaped by something neither of them fully understood at the time. And now that understanding had arrived. It did not feel like relief. It felt like the beginning of something far more unstable. The girl finally spoke again, softer than before. "Then what happens now?" The man looked at her for a long moment. Then finally he said, "Now, we finish what was stolen from us." And in that moment, the story did not end. It opened. Because the truth was no longer hidden.